I stood beneath the chandelier in an emerald silk dress and felt like a character in someone else's life. The lights scattered like brittle stars over the guests. The string quartet softened the edges of the room, and Richard raised his glass with that practiced, unshakable smile he'd worn at every public event for as long as I could remember. "To my rock," he said, and the room echoed back the toast with the polite applause of people who had known us for decades. 10 feet away, a woman in a blue dress laughed at something he said. For a fraction of a second, my whole world narrowed to the sound of that laugh. Time staggered in my chest, and the silk at my waist felt suddenly thin as tissue. I had rehearsed what dignity looked like for 40 years. I had rehearsed the smile. But in that moment, with that single word, rock, coming from his mouth and landing on someone else's laughter, the rehearsal broke. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. It helps me know that when I speak openly about this, I'm not only speaking to myself. 3 months earlier, my life had still seemed, in the small ways that matter, continuous. There are lives that are like a straight line drawn on paper, steady, predictable, comfortable. Mine had been that line. A house in an Ohio suburb with maple trees that turned incandescent in October, dinner with the children on Sundays, Richard's polished speeches, my painting studio in the carriage house behind the main home. We had friends, routines, nicknames. It was not a glamorous life, but it was ours. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon in March, I went into Richard's study to return a pair of reading glasses he had left on the desk. He was supposed to be in a meeting downtown. His car was in the driveway, but he'd forgotten the glasses often. The study smelled faintly of his cologne and the lemon polish he insisted on using. The laptop lay open, dark, with the tiny ring of dried coffee at one corner of the keyboard. I intended to pick up the glasses and leave. 5 minutes, no drama. I saw in the corner of the screen a small preview bubble from an email account. It wasn't a complete message, just the sender and the first line, and yet it looked like somebody had stepped into my house and rearranged everything overnight. It began with, "My darling Richard," and then a sentence so domestic and intimate I could taste the betrayal. Last night in room 447 was unforgettable. I sat down on the leather chair as if someone had told me a fact from another planet. For a long time, I did nothing. Part of me wanted to close the lid of the laptop and pretend I hadn't seen it. Part of me wanted to set the house on fire and erase the last 40 years. I did neither. I put the glasses on the desk as if I hadn't touched anything. I walked back to the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea. I called my sister, Carol, and told her, with my voice clipped and practical, that I had to talk. She drove over that afternoon. We sat in the kitchen and drank the same burnt tea and pretended to discuss recipes until the room stretched to the edges of what we needed it to be. Denial is not a rational state. It's muscle memory. I told myself several things: that the email was a mistake, that the account name could be a namesake, that people wrote foolish things they didn't mean, that our marriage had weathered storms. I reached for a list of all the ways Richard could still be the man I married. Those lists keep you sane for a little while. But the more I tried to look away, the more details leaked. I noticed that Richard had started to take Tuesday evenings out more often. He claimed it was a client dinner or a meeting. Receipts landing in the mail, hotel receipts sometimes, had vague corporate names. A scarf I didn't recognize was in his closet, folded with the care he reserved for handkerchiefs. There were 2 sets of toothbrushes in the guest bathroom that I hadn't bought. The second step after denial is investigation, not because I wanted to be an investigator, but because truth, once suspected, becomes unbearable to leave unfollowed. I am not proud of the small, furtive things I did. I explain them only because they were the tools by which I understood the scale of what I was facing. I opened his laptop again, this time with my hands steady, but my heart beating in new rhythms. I scrolled through messages and found a thread that folded inward like a map. There were dates, short diminutive lines of affection, mentions of hotels, see you Tuesday, and references to gifts that seemed to have no occasion. I saved images of the messages on a thumb drive and slid it into the pocket of my coat. I wrapped the drive in tissue and tucked it into a small box that had belonged to Carol. She'd given it as a joke gift for one of my birthdays, and I put it in a place I knew Richard never looked. I hid it in a way I can see now as theatrical, perhaps, It was in a box of sanitary items in the bathroom cabinet. If there is any foolishness to match the ingenuity of wrongdoing, it is the little theater with which we hide the proofs of other people's lives. I tell you this not to teach anyone how to hide a thing, but to show how absurdly human and messy the act of gathering evidence is. It is not a crime manual. It is a record of what desperation looks like when it wears the clothes of practicality. I recorded screenshots, dates, hotel names, receipts, and photographs, non-explicit images of hotel reservation confirmations, dinner receipts with Richard's name, small confirmation numbers. I printed some things. Paper felt more real than pixels. I numbered everything and placed them into a manila folder, as if building a case for a trial that would not be in court, but in the court of our family and friends.
Each item had a place and a weight. Email from Jennifer Walsh, March 12th. Hotel receipt, room 447, March 8th. Photo of ticket stub for a museum in another city, February 22nd. Seeing these items in an index gave me a terrible relief. It turned suspicion into a map. The map showed patterns. The meetings were not random. There were Tuesdays and Thursdays that Richard took off. There were occasional weekend nights away. There were discreet little gifts, an orchid here, an expensive pen there, that he claimed were tokens for clients. The important thing was that the map removed the luxury of doubt. Proof does that. It doesn't make the pain less, but it removes the rationalizations and the fog. I could have confronted him then and there. I pictured the scene over and over. Me on the staircase, him in the kitchen, the folder on the counter like a bomb. But the archive of our life together, photos of our children, letters we'd written in cheap hotel rooms when we were young and broke, the way his wedding ring had a small nick from the time our son Michael bit it as an infant, made immediate confrontation feel catastrophic rather than clarifying. I wanted to preserve something for my children, for myself. A hush descended. If I wanted justice, I decided, it would not be a private explosion. There was dignity in truth, yes, but dignity is not always a quiet thing. I thought about the consequences. If I called him out in private, he could apologize, soothe, move on, and the lie could continue elsewhere. If I did nothing, I would become complicit by silence. And if I exposed him, there would be carnage. Lives would be upended. Who had the right to make that choice? I decided I did. In my thinking, there is room for method, not because I fancied myself a strategist, but because I had lived enough life to know that catastrophes are less ruinous when contained by planning. I wanted to build a way to tell the truth so it could not be denied, and I wanted that truth to be received by people who had seen us as a unit for decades. A public reveal carried a terrible moral cost, I understood that, but it also carried the almost righteous guarantee that the story would not be noiselessly buried. Finding David's name, Jennifer's husband, came as a kind of inevitability. I knew little of him beyond the fact that they were married, had been married long enough to have that worn-in look of people who had argued over the color of curtains. I didn't know whether he suspected anything. I wanted to shield my children from the slow drip of lies, and I wanted restitution of a sort I couldn't define. I could have done any number of things, gone to an attorney first, told my children, moved out quietly. Instead, I wrote an email, addressed to a man I had never met. I began anonymously. There is a peculiar cruelty to sending the first message when your own world is unraveling. It feels like throwing a note into the ocean and hoping it reaches someone. My first communication to David was careful and factual. I did not use the language of accusation. I used the language of documentation. I attached the smallest, most damning of the proofs, a hotel receipt, and a short excerpt from the emails. A line that read, "Couldn't wait to see you again. Tuesday was perfect." I did not send everything. I sent what would make it impossible to pretend there was a coincidence. We met in a Starbucks on a gray Thursday. He looked older than his photos had suggested, and his hands trembled when he took the small stack of paper I slid across the table. I watched him read, the same way I had watched Richard read a toast under a chandelier. There was a moment where the man I had never met looked like he wanted to hit me, to tell me off for involving him, for breaking a marriage he had thought intact. Then his shoulders dropped in a way that was almost physical relief. "How much do you know?" he asked finally, voice low. I told him everything I could without laying out my entire hand. I told him of the pattern, the receipts, the emails, the way our lives had become parallel lies. David listened without interrupting. There was a sharpness in him, a mixture of embarrassment and a white-hot anger that matched my own. We formed in that quiet corner of a chain coffee shop, an alliance not born of glee,
but a precise mutual recognition. Two people who had been deceived by the same man and the same woman, both with families to think about, both with reputations and livelihoods, and in my case, a sister and children who knew me as the steady one. We agreed, with grudging practicality, that exposing the truth would have to be done in a way that minimized the collateral damage to the greatest extent possible, not to protect the guilty, but to protect the innocents hurt by the truth. The plan that grew between us was less theatrical than it sounds on paper. We spoke of timing, the social calendar that governs who attends which fundraiser, the list of guests who would ensure the story wasn't whispered away by sympathetic attendees. We spoke of method, not in technical detail, but about presentation. Documents would not be scattered like confetti. They would be presented as evidence, with short phrases read aloud, a single sentence here and there from an email that would pierce the air. The idea of surprising him in public satisfied a certain moral arithmetic for us both. If he'd insisted on secrecy, the shame should be handled in a space where secrets are harder to hide. There were moments in those weeks when the world felt like a mask I had to wear. I organized the anniversary party with an efficiency that shocked some of my friends. I chose the guest list to include those whose eyes I trusted to not look away. Carol, Emma from Seattle, Michael from Boston, neighbors, colleagues, the old friends who had seen us through more than one crisis.
People assumed it was about the milestone. 40 years of marriage deserved ceremony. We had been told that all our lives. It was, in a way, exactly that. Ceremony as theater, theater as reckoning. At home, I became two people. There was the Vivian who laughed at the dry jokes Richard made at the end of a long week and cooked the meals our family liked. There was the Vivian who sat into the night with the manila folder on the kitchen table. The dichotomy was exhausting. To the outside world, I continued to place the right napkins, to practice the perfect soft laugh that would coax people into comfortable stories. To myself, I practiced the words I would say when the time came to break the long, blue-backed silence that had held our lives in a neat, false shape. Not all planning is grand. Much of it was about small calibrations, ensuring the photographer would be in the right place at the right moment, not to manipulate a shot, but because pictures are persuasive, that the playlist would stop between toasts for a moment long enough to fill with silence, that the bandleader would pause on cue. I asked a friend to be ready with a camera, not for scandal, but to document what would be said. And every night as the party approached, I would take out the folder, look at the ticket stubs and email snippets, and feel the weight of each page. There are ethical questions that sit like flint in the corners of decisions like this. I am not immune to them. I asked myself whether exposing Richard would lead to cruelty on my part. Would the children see me as the instigator of public pain? Would I be remembered as the woman who humiliated a family for pride's sake? Those were not small questions. The evening I slid into Richard's study to return his glasses, I had not been thinking of any of this. But once the evidence sat like a physical thing in my hands, the moral landscape changed. Justice to me required more than private confrontation. It required that the truth be undeniable, and that it be seen by people who had observed us as a unit for years. In the weeks leading up to the party, I rehearsed conversations with myself. It surprised me how much I felt sorrow for Richard, not for what he had done, but for becoming someone who could do it. We had built a comfortable life together. Somewhere along the way, patterns had shifted. I wondered how many scattered grievances, how many unmet yearnings could lead a person to make choices like that. My sorrow did not absolve him. It sat beside my indignation like a second, quieter grief. Emma called me from Seattle and cried. She had seen the change in her father when she visited last winter. There was a distance in his conversation, a distractedness that made her feel like she needed to defend herself against a ghost of a man she once knew. Michael, more blunt and bracing in Boston, called me a week before the party and said, "Make sure you don't let him get away with that."
Their anger and confusion added a new pressure, a way in which my private calculus belonged to more people than me. Carol, meanwhile, was astonishing in her firmness. She offered to help with the guest list, to be a witness at the party, to sit quietly at my side when the time came. There is a particular kind of loyalty that comes from a sister who has seen you ugly and brave in equal measure. She never asked for details. She only offered presence, and that is sometimes the most useful of all strategies. There were nights I could not sleep. In those hours, I went back to the beginning with an almost childish persistence. The first ring on the desk, the first laugh that didn't belong to me. I remembered moments of laughter from our early years, the proposal at the beach, when he had bent on one knee in the sand with a chipped ring and a silly poem, the way we painted a tiny house we lived in when Michael was small, arguing about the shade of blue until we both laughed. Those memories were not neutral. They were the raw material that made betrayal so much worse. You don't only lose trust, you lose the story you told yourself about who you are. I kept telling myself that truth matters even when it costs. That was the phrase I repeated the week of the party, like a mantra. Truth may not be kind. Sometimes truth brings devastation. But for me, it was the alternative that felt worse. The slow erasure of self by a methodical deception. There was a part of me that worried about spectacle. I do not relish making people suffer. I believed then, and I believe now, that exposing Richard in a space filled with our friends was not about spectacle, but about accountability. He had spent years performing a public life. The platform, for once, would be used to direct light into the shadows he'd insisted on keeping. We set the date for early June. The house would be decorated in soft whites and greens. The chandelier over the dining table would throw its lights. The guest list would be long. Colleagues from Richard's firm, neighbors, family members, friends who had traveled the same roads with us. It would be a gathering that made the decision to tell the truth, both inevitable and visible. As the party approached, the evidence quietly grew. There was a file on my desk with slips of paper, hotel confirmations, the email with the line, "I missed you last night," receipts with his name, a photo of a napkin with room 447 scribbled on it. Some of the documents were dated, some were not, but the pattern built itself like frost on glass. I never allowed myself to read everything in one sitting. Some nights I leafed through the folder and stopped at names and dates, letting the truth sink into the body like a cold bath. There is a certain loneliness to living with knowledge that will change your family.
You are more awake to small ironies, the way he left his tie sloppily draped on a chair like he always did, the way the dog would follow him into the study when he left for the city. If you are honest with yourself, you know that some of the habits you protected were habits you had made room for. That does not excuse the betrayal. It only makes it clearer why people like me make the choices we make. Before the meeting with David and the rollout of the plan, I met with Patricia Chin, my attorney. Her presence was a kind of insurance, a reminder that there were consequences beyond the emotional, and that each action had legal ripples. We spoke in generalities. I told her I had documentation that made it impossible to ignore certain facts. She listened and advised caution about how the evidence would be presented and on preserving my rights. She did not give me instructions for exposure. She outlined the possible fallout and the legal pathways forward. That counsel was necessary, not for strategy whether to humiliate, but to ensure that when the dust settled, my future and my children's future could be protected. For months before the party, I had to play the role of host and complacent wife. Friends would ask, with the kind of small-minded curiosity people wear like perfume, how it felt to mark 40 years. I smiled and said the things people expect: grateful, blessed, humbled. Inside, a different vocabulary churned. Each laugh I forced at a joke was a small lie. Each hug at the end of a long day felt like an act of theater. There were nights when Richard and I slept in the same bed and I felt nothing, like two trees touching in a storm. I kept the folder close in the nightstand, as if proximity could shield me. The alliance with David had been unusual. There was a moment in the first week after we met when our shared hurt translated into practical tasks. We coordinated who would be present that night, how best to make the evidence plain, and how to handle the immediate aftermath so the children were not blindsided in more cruel ways than necessary. He brought his own pain and a desire for closure. We agreed to avoid public spectacle for the sake of schadenfreude. Our purpose was to reveal, not to gloat. That distinction mattered to me when, in the quiet of our plans, I sometimes felt a satisfaction that unsettled me. It was a dangerous pleasure to see the intricate web of deception suddenly visible, and I tried to keep it tempered with the knowledge that we were dismantling not merely a romance, but a network of lies. There were practical things we did. I made copies of the documents and gave a sealed set to Patricia for safekeeping. David and I rehearsed, in whispers, how the reveal might proceed. He insisted on dignity. He wanted the simplest, least humiliating form possible, and in an almost comic way, our shared desire to keep things restrained became another layer of theatricality. We both understood that the public was hungry for drama. We both wanted to deny it. The weeks before the party were an intense education in restraint. I learned how to place a napkin, how to make conversation about the weather. I learned how to hold my breath for a full toast and let it out slowly, like a measured exhale. I held rehearsals with the caterer, chose the music, paid attention to which tables would seat whom so that the reveal would land with the proper legal and emotional gravity. Each choice was a small strategy,
not for humiliation, but for clarity. The truth presented with evidence is hard to deny. The night before the anniversary, I packed a small bag for the carriage house. It was an odd superstition, a movement toward leaving that felt more like starting. I slept poorly, my mind replaying conversations and imagining sequences many times over. At 3 a.m, I thought of the beach when Richard had proposed, the gulls shrieking and our shoes full of sand, and I cried quietly into the pillow for the loss of a life I had thought secure. On the morning of the party, I put on the emerald dress. It felt absurdly symbolic, emerald like the green of the maple leaves outside our Ohio home, a color neither hiding nor flaunting. I did my hair the way I had the night of our wedding, soft waves that framed my face, and looked at myself in the mirror as if to check I could still be the person I had been. Carol arrived early. She took my hand and said nothing, which was all the blessing I needed. Downstairs, the house hummed with preparation. Richard walked in the room in a crisp suit and kissed my cheek with the kind of small tenderness that belongs to routine marriages. He said, "Are you nervous? We'll keep it small, just family and a few friends." He had no idea how monumental his words would sound in a few hours. He did not know the folder sitting under the pillow I had left in the guest room. He did not know that his rock was in a blue dress and 10 feet away. As the guests arrived, I watched the room fill with faces that had known us through decades of dinners and children, holidays and hospital visits. There was laughter and small talk about gardens. The string quartet tuned with the precise indifference of musicians who had played these events before. No one noticed the tremor beneath my laughter. Some people never do. People who have known you for years see you as a collection of habitual reactions, and they believe in them more than they believe in the truth. Richard stood to give his toast. He began with the usual. Thank yous, jokes about my cooking, a line about the years that had passed like houses on a road. Then he smiled at the woman in blue and said, with the sort of fondness that had once been reserved for me, "To my rock." The room applauded once, politely. In that instant, I understood how public rituals can both sanctify and punish. My heart made a decision before my mind finished its sentences. I rose from the table.
People looked at me, because when a woman stands at a dinner like that, people look. I walked to the head of the room with my folder in hand, and the laughter in the background dimmed into a low, curious murmur. I had not planned a long speech. I only planned for the truth to be seen. I unsealed one envelope and pulled out a single sheet. I read aloud one line from an email and a hotel receipt number. Short, precise, undeniable. The room's polite murmur became a raw, breathing silence. Richard's face changed slowly like something melting. Jennifer's life in the blue dress died midair. Some people looked away. Others leaned in as if toward a dangerous bird. What happened in that room could have been violence or justice. It was both. The sound that followed was not a single note, but a chord of reactions. Gasps, the clatter of a dropped glass, whispers. My children stood as if someone had told them to. Emma's eyes were wide with a hurt that made her beautiful and tragic in the same instant. Michael's jaw tightened, and I could see his body preparing for some physical expression of rage, even as he held himself back. I did not gloat. I read a line and a receipt and placed them on the table. The proof was small and judicial. It was not a story. It was a set of facts presented plainly. People looked down at the documents and read them. Someone started to whisper, and a chorus of names rose and fell like a tide. The floor of the room shifted. It was no longer Richard's stage, but an arena where our shared myth of normalcy came apart. I felt neither triumph nor total despair. Instead, there was a strange focus, like the way a mind becomes precise when it sheds illusions. You will ask whether I regretted it afterward. There were things that night I regretted, with the small human shame we all hold for causing pain. But I did not regret the decision to make truth visible. The fallout in that room was immediate, loud, and ugly in ways that invited both compassion and rage. Friends who'd known us for decades looked stunned. Others who had been attentive to rumor did not look surprised at all. Richard's hands trembled. Jennifer's face had drawn into lines that made her look years older. David approached, and the meeting between the two of them was an ugly, necessary affair. I watched from the edge of the chaos as alliances shifted without ceremony. People moved toward their kin, toward those they loved. After the first storm of voices, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Carol. "Are you all right?" she asked, and I realized my chest had been a machine of controlled panics. My lungs filled with breath for the first time since I stepped into the room. The documents lay on the table like small, lethal birds. People read them, and the reading changed the texture of our relationships that very night. We left the party in a flurry of coats and cars and harsh, whispered words.
The drive away from the house was impossibly quiet. Richard drove with his knuckles white. In the back seat, my children were sullen and small and large at once. Emma clung to me for a moment and said, "Why did he?" There are questions like that no answer can heal immediately. That night, when the guests had dispersed and the house settled into a suspicious silence, I sat at the kitchen table with the manila folder open. The papers looked like ordinary things in the lamplight. They were not. They were the bones of the life that had been formed around a lie. I thought of the beach and the proposal and the chipped ring and felt the strangest gratitude for every memory. Pain recalled with a kind of stubborn affection that kept me human. When dawn leaked through the curtains, I called Patricia. We spoke about next steps, the attorney language, divorce papers, settlement, custody concerns, and about protecting the children's privacy. She spoke in the language of law. I spoke in the language of home. There was a negotiation between the two that felt, when it happened, like a hand being offered across a broken bridge. In the days that followed, the social and legal consequences began to manifest in small, inexorable ways. Colleagues at Richard's firm began to ask questions. Jennifer faced rumors at work and calls that left a ringing in her voicemail. David took steps quietly to protect his children. People took sides in ways that felt both expected and cruel. It was ordered chaos. There are things I would say now that I did not say then. I did not want to ruin anyone's career. I did not wish for our children to carry scars that were public. But at the time, the compass needle was pointed toward clarity. The truth had to be visible, and the consequences would be unavoidable. There is no heroism in being the instrument of somebody's downfall. There is only the cold arithmetic of decisions made under duress. In the quiet of the first week after the party, I walked into my painting studio and stood before the easel. For months, I'd not touched my paints. The canvas was blank and terrible in its potential. Pain, I discovered, is also a kind of fuel. I picked up a brush and made a mark that was not pretty, but was honest. It felt like a small reclaiming. Color as a statement that my life could still hold more than this rupture. At night, when the phone calls had slowed and the immediate fury had become a steady background hum, I asked myself the question that most people do. Did I do the right thing? The answer is neither simple nor moral in a single tone. I did what I felt necessary to stop a slow erasure of myself. I knew it would cost us all, including those I love. I accepted that cost with my eyes open. There are chapters of this story that are not yet written. The legal filings, the negotiations, the inevitable reckonings at work and in small towns, and I will tell them. But for now, know this. I kept my head when it mattered. I chose evidence over rumor, truth over quiet dignity. I chose clarity over the safe, silent compromise that keeps marriages intact but erodes the self. When I look back on the emerald dress and the chandelier, I do not see only humiliation. I see the moment when I decided that 24 years of small deceptions would not be the ledger of my final decades. I do not say this to boast. I say it because the decision to make truth visible, even when it causes pain, is the decision by which I have rebuilt myself. In the weeks that followed, lawyers took over more of the conversation. David and Jennifer's marriage, unsurprisingly, began to fray under the weight of the revelations. There was fallout at work for Jennifer. People wrote emails and texts that were cruel and sometimes sympathetic. For all the ugliness, there were small acts of kindness that mattered. A neighbor dropping by with soup, Carol taking Emma out for a day of the lake to let the shore air away some of the sting, Michael piling wood in the backyard, as if manual labor could mend a shape of things broken. I started to paint again in earnest. I rented a small studio in town where I could go and make marks that did not care about reputations. I took a short trip to the lake alone, spread a blanket, and watched geese cut the sky. The world continued to move around me, even as mine had gone through a recalibration. People offered condolences and judgment in equal measures. I let both pass through me like wind. There are people who will ask why I chose public exposure over private resolution. There are people who will call me cruel for choosing spectacle. I accept those judgments with a youthful patience. When you have been lied to for years, and when those lies have a rhythm and a way of seating themselves between you and the people you love, you will find a method to stop them. For me, that method was exposure. For others, it may not be. That is the complicated human truth. And yet, in the quiet moments when the fight subsides but the consequences remain, I think about the odd solace that comes from having chosen to be seen. There is dignity in standing up and saying, "This is what happened," and offering your evidence like a testimony. It does not fix everything. It does not return stolen years, but it places the ledger where it should be, out in the light. As the legal steps began to take shape, I asked myself what life after all of this might look like. I wanted small things, the smell of oil paint in a sunlit studio, friends who could sit and talk without the safety net of pretense, a vacation without the ghost of this scandal following in the luggage. I wanted to be able to tell my children that truth mattered, not because it would be easy, but because it would be honest. There are more things to tell. The meetings with attorneys that turned into negotiations, the days when the children demanded to know how their lives would change, the times when I doubted my own courage.
Those are chapters that stand ahead, heavier and grimmer in places, lighter in others. Tonight, as I write with a cup of tea cooling beside me, the manila folder sits in the safe where Patricia suggested it. The papers are not just evidence now. They are a record of a decision that, whatever else it did, made me into someone who refused to be erased. I do not take comfort in the ruin that followed. I take it in the knowledge that truth, however costly, cleared the air in which I must now live. There is a part of me that worries about the future in ways I didn't before. How will we go forward with our children? What about the people we loved who have been damaged in the crossfire? These are not rhetorical, they are real. There is no single, simple moral ledger where the right and wrong of this can be cleanly tallied. But there is also a part of me that feels a brittle, unexpected relief. The house may be quieter, the paintings may be harder to sell, the town may whisper. Those are small prices for the clarity of truth. And truth, once spoken aloud in a room gilded with chandeliers and full of people who had known us for years, becomes harder to deny. When I look back on the weeks leading up to the party, I remember the smell of lemon polish in the study, the hospital receipts folded into a folder, the taste of tea in the kitchen that afternoon I discovered the email. I remember sliding a thumb drive into my pocket and hiding it like an absurd little talisman. I remember meeting David in a coffee shop and recognizing in him a grief that mirrored my own. I remember standing in that emerald dress and making a decision that would forever reframe my life. What I cannot yet tell you is how the legal battles will finally land, or whether the cleaving of our family will produce a new kind of peace. Those pages are still turning. There will be hearings and agreements and quiet, painful conversations over kitchen tables. There will be nights when the children are angry and nights when they come and sit with me as if nothing has happened. There will be days when the town shutters close and days when doors open. For now, the evidence has spoken louder than rumor. The consequences are in motion. I have chosen, with all the trembling a human hand can hold, to stand in the light. The light is bright and hot, and for the first time in a long time, I can see myself. For the first time in a long time, I can see myself. The legal work began with the dull inevitability of paperwork. Patricia sat across from me in her office with a stack of forms and a clarity that felt like armor. We spoke about timelines, temporary orders, financial disclosures, who would stay where while the house was being sorted. She was practical in the way only the practiced can be, calm in tone, meticulous in deadlines. "We will protect the children," she said. "We will protect your rights." Those were not promises of comfort. They were tasks to be completed. I signed things I didn't fully understand and trusted Patricia to translate legalese into a map I could follow. The first hearing was procedural. A judge assembled the obvious facts into neutral sentences. The public record, which had been private for so long, was now dotted with dates and documents and attorneys' names. That was part of what I needed, an external structure that reflected the truth I'd already set down on my kitchen table. There were practicalities I had to manage. Emma, her face still hollow from that night, wanted time in Seattle to breathe. Michael, furious in his own quiet way, moved back to Boston for a few weeks to stay with friends and clear the edges of his anger. Carol came and went like a lighthouse, bringing casseroles and a steady presence that required no words. The children needed choices, and Patricia made sure those choices were legally visible. Details like custody arrangements and who would retain certain assets were discussed with the gravity of things that alter daily life. Richard's initial reaction was predictable. Legal posturing, consultations with his partners, statements of regret that always stopped short of complete admission. He hired counsel and began the maneuvering you expect when someone with a public life tries to keep a semblance of control. His firm faced whispered questions, clients asked to be kept out of public scrutiny. In small ways, the scaffolding of his career shifted. I never wanted to see him humiliated beyond the exposure necessary to end the deceit, and yet I understood that actions have consequences. Jennifer's life changed in visible ways. Where she had previously been another person's background, she became a name people repeated in staccato whispers. Her role at work was placed under review. Colleagues who had been cordial now avoided eye contact. There is little poetic justice in watching someone you once imagined as an abstract figure come apart. I had not wanted this level of collateral pain, but the revelations were now a public matter, and employers respond to public matters. David filed for separation. The divorce papers followed. The small town we lived in, Ohio-friendly, aware of everyone, shifted in its social gravity. People took sides without knowing the half of what we had known. Rumor and truth braided together into something difficult to sort. There were mediation sessions with lawyers in sterile rooms. The word settlement moved between our desks and became a ledger of what each of us could carry forward. Patricia negotiated with a precision I admired. In the end, I retained the house, our home with the Maples and the Carriage House studio, and an equitable settlement that allowed me to keep the life I had known while giving me the means to live in it independently. We arranged for financial support for the children where necessary. I will not recite dollar amounts. They belong to the private ledger of our lives.
What mattered was that the house and the studio where I had once painted commissions and learned to confess my moods in color remained a place I could return to. There is a curious administrative cruelty to divorce. One day you are introduced as a partner at social events. The next you are listed as former spouse in the same columns that once touted your shared philanthropy. I wondered sometimes whether the people who'd applauded our anniversaries understood the reclassification of our lives. Some friends drifted away, unsure of where to put their loyalties. Others came closer, with a steadier, more honest kind of support. Family therapy was an ugly, helpful thing. The first session was mostly anger and raw edges. Emma refused to sit in the same room as her father. Michael spoke in single-line accusations that vibrated with grief. The therapist, a woman with kind eyebrows and an incredible patience for fury, allowed us to speak and then demanded we listen. She pointed out that our children had not only lost a father, they had lost the version of him they had trusted. It was shocking to realize the degree to which deceit reimagines memory. The therapist helped us hold space for contradiction, love for a parent who had also been a liar. Those sessions were messy and long and necessary. There were moments of fierce confrontation that did not end in blows, but in words that felt like they could break bones. Michael did not strike Richard. Instead, he forced a conversation in which the son became the moral commentator. "How do you expect us to trust you again?" he asked, shaking with something that looked like old, white-hot grief. Richard tried to answer in ways that smelled like excuses. When Michael left the room, empty-handed and hollow-eyed, I understood that reconciliation, if it happened at all, would be slow and on the children's terms. David, who had been such a functional ally during the planning, chose a quieter path after the public reveal. His marriage unraveled in private rooms and in consultations with an attorney. The loss he endured was different from mine. It was also a loss of the partner who had been part of his daily life. I had no desire to prolong his pain. We kept in touch only sporadically, a string of messages that contained the practical, dates for depositions, times for meetings, and the occasional humane appreciation. "Thank you," he wrote once, "for being honest in a way I could not be brave enough to be." That message arrived on an afternoon when the sky was a dull Ohio pewter, and I folded it into my thoughts like a small offering. The town was a theater of gossip for a while. People whispered in grocery stores. Someone left a bouquet of lilies tied with a bow outside our gate with no card. There were moments of cruelty. An old acquaintance once said, "I always wondered," in a tone that suggested she had been an oracle and we be unwilling disciples.
There were also surprising acts of kindness. A neighbor that I had hardly known brought over soup and sat long enough to listen, then left without questions. Those small acts meant more than any statement of legal victory. At home, I worked on my paintings as if I was scraping something off myself. The first works were dark, blues and blacks that felt like catalogs of night. But gradually, green slipped back into my palette. The bright, stubborn green of new maple leaves in early spring. The particular tonal note of the emerald dress that had held both my dignity and my decision. I painted a series of small canvases that were more like studies of not being the person who had been deceived, but being the person who had refused erasure. One canvas had a single vertical line of white running through a patch of deep green. My therapist suggested it felt like a doorway. I sold a painting at a local gallery opening. A modest sum, but a legible sign that my work could still touch someone else. I took a trip to Lake Erie by myself that autumn. The water was cold, the air clean in ways that make you feel slightly less complicated. I sat on a blanket with a thermos and watched geese cross the sky. There is a simple therapy in seeing a larger world continue unchanged by your calamities. On that trip, I wrote letters, not to be sent, simply written, addressing the younger parts of myself and the parts that had been quiet for too long. Those letters were not performative. They were a practice in naming the things I had lost and the things I wanted to regain. The legal conclusion, what people call the settlement, arrived 6 months after the exposé. It was a negotiated end that felt like the closing of a book for which we'd already written the last chapters in the living room. The judge signed off on an equitable division. Richard accepted a set of conditions that included limitations on certain public representations and an agreed-upon custody arrangement that prioritized the children's stability. Jennifer's divorce was finalized quietly. David moved into a small rental with his children and began, tediously, humanely, to rebuild. After the paperwork was filed, our social circles recalibrated. Some people left both of us behind, others stayed. I found myself invited to a brunch where the women who remained spoke candidly about their marriages in ways I had rarely heard in our social world. There was less pretense and more ordinary candor. Someone admitted an affair gone wrong, another confessed to a marriage of convenience. The tone of our community shifted from theatrical praise to the sober confessions of people who had been surprised by life. I realized I wasn't the only one with a story like mine. There are many stories, different and similar, and that recognition made me less alone. There were hard nights, of course.
I would wake at 3 and replay the tenor of certain voices, the particular cadence of Richard's apology that had not reached the level of truth I needed. Sometimes anger would bloom in me like a rash, hot and irrational. Other times sadness hit me like a sudden cold wave. Those moods are not linear progressions. They are weather systems. I learned to be patient with them, not to expect a tidy horizon where none existed. One of the things that surprised me was the way small acts of normal life felt revolutionary. Driving to the farmer's market and choosing vegetables without consulting someone else felt like autonomy. Teaching myself to fix the leaky faucet in the downstairs bathroom, that small, practical competence, felt like reclaiming a tiny kingdom. I enrolled in a life drawing class at the community college and laughed at my inability to replicate the contours of a human figure. In that class, a woman in her 70s taught me the virtue of perseverance. The body betrays us, she said, but the hand remembers. I thought of that line when I was in front of a blank canvas late at night. I began to teach small workshops in my studio, painting for people who felt grief or transition in their bones. The first workshop had 5 women, each with her own story of loss or change. We painted quietly, and afterward someone brought wine, and we spoke of things that had been unsayable at dinner parties. There is a humility in community that is different from any social pretense, a sense that you are in the room together, that your misfortunes are not badges but shared weather. Months turned into a year. The public noise decreased. The town's gossip returned to other matters. My children found ways to be near each other again without being their old selves. Emma went to Europe for a semester and sent me a postcard with a smudged photo of a cathedral. Michael began to date again, awkwardly but with courage. Carol returned to her life with the steady cadence of someone who had been through a storm and came out with a few fewer illusions about control. There were moments of forgiveness, too, not sweeping absolution, but small human mercies. Once in the backyard, when the light was the particular gold of late afternoon, Richard and I spoke in a way that did not try to fix everything. We spoke of the children and of the practicalities of shared years now ending. He expressed regret. I expressed how his choices had reshaped me. We did not reconcile, if reconciliation implies a return to what had been. But there was a recognition between us, a mutual acceptance of how our lives would now move apart. People will ask whether I felt triumphant when the papers were signed, when the settlement was public. The truth is more complicated. There was relief, certainly. Relief that the truth could not be twisted into rumor anymore. Relief that there was a clean break in the legal sense.
But there was also an ache, grief for the years that had been lived alongside a deception, regret for the toll on my children. The decision to expose was not an act of revenge so much as a hard, protective measure. I would do it again, I think, because silence would have stolen me away in a slow, less visible manner. But I would have done it with a deeper awareness of the damage public exposure does to collateral lives. As I rebuilt, more open to new relationships of a different kind, not romantic entanglements, though I am not immune to kindness and to human warmth, but friendships that were honest in ways the old social fabric had not been. I met women who had been widowed, women who had divorced quietly, women who had chosen not to marry at all, We ate dinners that were imperfect and delicious. We took trips to local gardens and bookshops, and once to a small museum where we stood and looked at paintings that had nothing to do with our immediate lives. Art became my anchor. I had a small show at a regional gallery, a modest affair with friends and neighbors, and to my surprise, people from the town who had seen the story play out and wanted to look at the aftermath and pigment. People asked me about the paintings, and I talked about color and time and the way some marks on canvas can be a kind of truth-telling. It felt good to see my work stand for something besides the noise it had been surrounded by. There are practical remnants of the affair, of course. There are family holidays charged with new rituals and new rules. There are phone calls where laughter feels out of place. But there are also mornings in the studio when the light comes through the windows and the smell of turpentine feels like renewal. There is the simple pleasure of making a meal and not having to calculate whether it will be judged for reasons unconnected to the food. There is the small mercy of being someone who is visible for being herself, not for a curated public image. If I can offer anything from this, it is a messy counsel. Truth matters, but truth sometimes costs. You must weigh what you will bear in silence against what the world will say when you speak. There is no one-size-fits-all answer. For me, exposing the affair that night under the chandelier in my emerald dress was a terrible kind of necessary. It cleared the air and made possible a life I could own. Months later, at an exhibition opening, a woman asked me quietly, "Do you regret the way you exposed him?" I thought of the way the light had fallen that night and how many faces had shifted. I thought of nights spent painting and of my children's slow, patient work toward healing. I answered, "I regret the pain it caused, but not the necessity of truth." She nodded in a way that made me think she understood the difference between justice and spectacle. On a cool spring morning, I stood in my studio and looked at a small painting that had been titled in my head as After the Chandelier.
It was not pretty in any conventional sense. It held a streak of emerald down the center, an echo, perhaps, of the dress, and around it, the canvas was weathered and notched in places that felt like honest scars. I touched the frame with my thumb and felt some small, steady contentment. I had been through something that reshaped me. I had preserved my home and my children, and in small yet crucial ways, my dignity. If you have found your way to this story and it has touched something in you, know that you are not alone in carrying contradictions. Truth does not always arrive with neat resolution. It arrives, sometimes, in fragments. A verdict, a settlement, a small painting, the long rebuilding of ordinary trust. Those fragments, assembled over time, become the architecture of a life rebuilt. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe and share it with someone who might need to hear that truth, while messy, can be a tool of liberation. Thank you for listening to my story. I'm still painting, still living, and still learning to be kind to myself in the light.